The City Below the Cloud by T.S. Galindo. Read by the author. Chapter 9. The Tower. Through the open door of the elevator, Kalan saw a wall of windows overlooking something that hadn't been seen by anyone below the cloud in living memory. The horizon. She saw the cloud below, writhing slowly like a black boiling sea stretching out into infinity. In the distance, the peak of a mountain breached the inky depths like the face of a drowning swimmer desperate for breath. Between her and the mountain were several other towers rising from the cloud, each with a colorful array of solar panels in the shape of a different flower. Having never seen a flower, she marveled at the novelty of the enormous distant sculptures. Their stalks, glimmering panels of glass, reflected the noon sun from overhead. Gliders with long trails of colored silk flew between the towers. Her eyes watered from the brightness of the crisp white sky, but she willed them stay open, lest she miss any details. "It goes forever," she whispered. The far-off line of the horizon drew her attention. How does it split like that, like two worlds meeting for the first time? A world of light and one of dark, like me. Am I the first to come from the dark to this light world? She stepped out of the elevator onto a thick plush carpet. The sensation was at once pleasurable and unnerving. She'd only ever walked on concrete and metal grating. She took another step, indulging in the spongy sinking feeling. Then she walked across to the glass and put her hands on it. It's cold, like metal. The air here is even worse. There's probably nothing of the cloud in it at all. I finally get somewhere that has clear air, and I can't breathe it. Movement behind her prompted her to turn around. Two small metal spheres rolled down the hallway in her direction. They stopped where she'd been standing, then both started rolling back and forth as if they were dancing. She crouched down and looked closer. There were tiny black needles shooting out of the bottom, just before hitting the ground, then retreating back into the ball. What are they doing? It looks like goo is coming out and going back in. Are they going back and forth over my footprints? Are they cleaning my footprints? Why? And why would you waste bio-goo cleaning a floor? She shifted her boot to look under it. There was an imprint in the carpet where she'd been standing, but it didn't look dirty. She tried to poke one of the balls. It rolled backward out of the way and stopped like it was waiting for her to try it again. After a few seconds, it resumed its cleaning. The other ball finished the footprint it was working on and moved to the next one. Are they going to follow me the whole time I'm here? She shrugged and stood up, noticing the hallway for the first time. It ran along the windows in both directions. To her right, it turned a corner into the tower. To her left, it led into a room. She walked in the direction of the room, then turned around when she heard one of the robots bumping against the glass. It rolled up the window to where she had touched the glass with her hands. She smiled and continued down the hall. The hallway opened into a luxurious open area as big as 20 units below the cloud. The windows formed one wall of the room. The rest was a great semicircle of wood panels, each from a different type of tree, stretching 20 meters across. At the back of the room was a waterfall splashing liters of water per minute onto a stone floor. She found the splashing sound somewhat soothing, in contrast to the trickle of water in the mushroom monkey's lair. In the center of the room was a sunken area surrounded by flowing sheets of silk hanging from the ceiling, rotating around the pit on a track. Inside were what looked like giant misshapen colored glass beads of various colors. The beads were arranged along the outside of the pit with large cushions between them, and a low circular table in the center. So many colors, so beautiful. Everything is colorful here, even the walls, and everything is so bright. The light, it's everywhere. There's even light falling from the ceiling. Why? There's already so much coming in from outside. Beyond the pit, along the far wall, were bookshelves packed with thick, old-looking books. They were the only things that looked worn or used in the room. Kalan had seen books before. It was rare, but sometimes they would show up in the yard. To her, books were a useless curiosity filled with unintelligible symbols. Reading had been lost below the cloud. The closest thing were the pictographs of the services or products offered found on the neon signs. Even the task coordinator showed only symbols and numbers, presenting the least amount of information necessary for the user. Books were only useful for trade to some of the more eclectic vendors in the markets, but the values varied wildly even among them. Seth had found two in the time she'd been scavenging. One was like the large ones on the shelves, filled with neat rows of indecipherable symbols. The other was a large, thin picture book. She traded the thick book to someone at a market, but kept the picture book for herself for a while. The pictures were bright and colorful, with small blocks of the rows of symbols on each. I remember when Seth was younger, she and Kalan would sit and look through the book trying to come up with stories to fit the pictures. The books on the shelf all looked the same to Kalan. They were all the thick, unknowable kind. Why would anyone need so many of the same thing? What's the point? They take up so much space. And how would you move everything in here? This place is so strange. The air is so clear and moist. There's free water just spilling on the floor, and free light drenching everything. But it doesn't look like there's anyone here to use any of it. Everything here is wasted. Great, now I sound like the mushroom. She walked further into the room. There were more of the giant beads and some smaller beads next to them piled up in front of the shelves. As one of the silken sheets fluttered by, she saw someone sitting on one of the beads, or rather, in one of them. The smaller bead next to them was a different shape than the others, taller and thinner, forming a small table. On top was a conical glass balanced on its tip. The person was sitting inside the larger bead. The bead, which seemed solid and immovable by its size and apparent density, was actually extremely malleable. It formed into the perfect chair for them. It wrapped around their body, forming armrests and a headrest with just enough support to minimize fatigue and discomfort. Their legs were outstretched and crossed over an extended portion, which nestled around their legs perfectly, preventing them from straining any muscles. They looked up at Kalan as she came into their view. The section of bead around their head and neck dropped into the rest of the bead as if it suddenly became liquid, freeing their head for movement. As they turned their head, the book they were reading instinctively dropped a bit. The armrests, instead of dripping into the bead like the headrest, just pressed in as if it was a pillow. They looked at Kalan with wonder and excitement in their eyes, and said, "Well, look at you. I thought I heard the lift arrive. You must be the, scrubber, that's it. I must say, you've had me waiting for quite some time. I put that request in yesterday, and I had to renew it at least twice." The confused and uncomfortable expression on Kalan's face gave the person pause. Kalan responded slowly, carefully repeating the strange words. "Yesterday? Yes, I put the request in yesterday." They were cut off by Kalan's alarmed reaction to something outside the window. A white capsule burst from the top of the mountain in the distance, shooting up into the air. A moment later there was a clap of thunder that shook the tower. She could see the other towers visibly sway and turn from the shockwave. The capsule kept rising into the sky, growing smaller as it broke through the planet's gravitational pull, until finally it disappeared from view. Kalan stood still, watching the mountain for any other changes, every muscle tense. The person who'd been watching Kalan's reaction, instead of the capsule, asked, "Have you never seen a shipment launch? They happen every 12 hours. I suppose you wouldn't be able to see them from below, but surely you've heard them." All at once Kalan understood what she'd just witnessed, the psycho-thunder. She turned toward them, still somewhat startled, and mumbled, "No, I've felt the quakes and heard the thunder, but no one knows what causes it. Do you know?" "Well, of course, everyone knows. It's the shipments. All those refined minerals get packed into containers and shipped off-world. You mean you can actually feel the ship building up speed in the tunnel on the surface?" "I suppose that makes sense. Can't imagine it's very quiet. You see, to get into space, the ship has to be going some astoundingly fast speed. I don't know what it is. I'm not a launch engineer. Anyways, instead of strapping all our valuable merchandise to thousands of tons of explosives, as they did in the old days, we let it build up speed inside a giant electromagnetic tube that's laid out under the city in a huge circle. The ship goes round the track something like 20 times. 15. Right, 15 times. Then it leaves the track and goes into the launch tube that climbs up the mountain, where it launches into orbit without having to use a single gram of onboard fuel. It's an amazing piece of technology. It must have cost multitudes to build, but now that it is, the profit margin should be enormous. As the person gave this lesson, they stood up. The process was one seamless motion, entirely natural and unconscious on their part. The moment their feet moved away from their perch on the bead, the footrest retreated into the main portion, just as the headrest had done, like water falling sideways into the bead. As they moved their feet under their body and straightened out their torso to be vertical, the bead supported their back, lifted their body to the correct height to stand, and sunk inward to allow for their feet. Once standing, they closed their book, rested it on the bead table, and picked up the glass. Then walked over to Kalan. As soon as they were out of the way of the bead, it dripped into the same shape as the rest of the beads in the room. Now, pardon, my name is Marquis Trellis Haverty Vanderson III. That's of the Skyrise Vandersons, of course, not those boisterous tower-hopper Vandersons. I find it so malheureux that we have to share our name with those Pobets. You may call me Marquis Trellis, if you desire. And what, my, interesting friend, is your name? Said Trellis with a flowery bow and many dramatic hand gestures and eyebrow expressions. Barely understanding what she'd just heard, she replied, My name is Kalan? After a moment of inquisitive silence, Trellis said, Kalan? That's it? No titles, no surname, no degrees, no lineage, no guild, no way to differentiate you from any other Kalan that might come crawling out of the refuse chute? Well, I suppose that'll do for our purposes today, but I've never heard of such a thing. Now, let's take a look at you. You certainly are a sight. My word. The Marquise was walking with an odd, flowery gait around Kalan, looking up and down her body, studying her. Kalan stood uncomfortably while trying to turn to keep him in front of her. Trellis's clothes were strange to her, so while she was being reviewed, she examined him. He wore a precisely tailored jacket made of lilac-covered velvety fur material, with comically large and elaborately embroidered cuffs and lapels. He also wore a pink shirt with frills and charcoal-gray slacks with black embroidery down the sides. His shoes were plum-colored, complementing his jacket, made of intricately sculpted leather. For Kalan, the most interesting thing about him was his skin, which was a dense golden bronze color. She looked down at the skin on her hand to see if it was the same color in the saturating light. It was not. It remained the same ashy gray as it had always been, only brighter. His hair also caught her attention. It was strands of gold implanted into his scalp with nanotech, allowing for on-demand styling. Currently it was in the shape of an asymmetric swoop, arching several centimeters from the top of his head and backward, ending in a large curl. Their eyes met when the two finished examining each other, during which the Marquis kept mumbling to himself, Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. He smiled, raised his glass, and said, You, madam, are a marvelous sensory experience. Cheers. He started to take a sip, then abruptly stopped and said, Oh my, but I haven't offered you anything to drink. You must forgive me. Come, come. He grabbed Kalan by the elbow and dragged her over to the wall near where she'd entered the room. She saw the cleaning ball robots make their way into the room, still busy cleaning footprints. Trellis pressed on one of the panels. Several of them spun around, revealing trays of bottles filled with colored liquids, while another panel opened and a curved wooden plank emerged, forming a bar complete with stools. Trellis sat her down. Here, have a seat. I'll make you something extra special, commanded Trellis. He busied himself behind the bar, pouring different amounts of several of the bottles on the wall into a silver canister. Kalan was surprised when he shook the canister inhumanly fast with one hand. He noticed her expression and said, Ah, yes, my arm is prosthetic. Most of me is, actually. Can't tell, can you? We Vandersons like to keep things sophisticated. None of those showy multi-spectrum prosthetics for us. The more realistic, the better. When he was done pouring the mixture into a glass, he placed it in front of Kalan, who looked down at it and sniffed. Invisible fumes coming off the liquid stung her nostrils even more than the air did. She backed away from it and asked, "What is it?" "It's a special cocktail I've been developing over the years. Try it. It'll crunch your world," said Trellis with an expectant grin on his face. Kalan hesitated as she picked up the glass. She wasn't sure if she should drink it, knowing what non-acid rainwater tasted like, but she was curious. She lifted the glass to her lips, closed her nostrils from inhaling the fumes, and took a tiny sip. It immediately burned her mouth, and the fumes invaded her lungs as she tried to cough. She dropped the glass on the floor and continued coughing. She remembered the filter air can and hoped she wouldn't vomit mushrooms here. Trellis came around the table and slapped her on the back, saying, "Ha ha, I told you. Good, isn't it? I'm glad you like it," completely oblivious to how much pain she was in. He led her over to the sunken area and down the steps, sitting her onto one of the large pillows. She eventually stopped coughing, but still felt the burned parts of her mouth, lungs, and esophagus. She'd never had alcohol before. There were no crops to produce it below. The only thing they could have been used to create it was rice, but it was only sold cooked from the dispensaries, and there wasn't anywhere to house the equipment needed to ferment it. The craft faded from memory. Once she finished coughing, she noticed the pillow she was sitting on was more of a balloon made of a clear vinyl-like substance. Inside was an aquarium, complete with fish and vegetation. She gazed astoundingly at one of the other similar pillows. Trellis started speaking while she was lost in the aquatic microcosm. "Now, as much as I'd love to chat with you all day, you do have a job to do. There is this unsightly growth you see, forming on the outside of the tower, just below the apartment. It looks as though it's trying to destroy my reputation. It's a large fungus of all things, just as I've been having my chemists start working on a solution to rid the city of all its fungi. This monstrosity starts growing right out of the smog. But I ask you, how would it look if the leader of the anti-fungal campaign had a giant mushroom crawling its way up to his apartment? Terrible, that's how. And then, to make things worse, I lose a robot trying to get the thing off. The monkey was right. He is trying to destroy them, us, all," she thought. Trellis continued, "You see, before I sent for you, I had one of my robots go out and try to pry the thing off the side of the building." "Robots? He has robots?" Kalan tensed, remembering the robots she'd seen a cycle ago. "Of course it fell. The things are supposed to be able to handle any task, and the company claims they're intelligent. Ha! Then of course they said it wasn't their fault and refused to replace it. That's when I decided to seek an expert. That's you, you see. I knew if anyone could do it, it'd be someone from below. Everyone knows you're the best at this sort of thing. Oh, I hope I'm not keeping you from anything important while you're up here dealing with my little problem." The pause in the onslaught of speech signaled to Kalan that Trellis wanted her to answer, but she didn't know what to say. She was still trying to comprehend what the Marquise had been talking about, and she was also having trouble keeping up with his quick way of talking. She tried her best to answer. No, I'd be scrubbing anyway, if I was below. I didn't even know there was an above." "Really? You know, there are those of us, myself included, who wonder about what life is like down there. Along with being the leader of the movement to eradicate the fungus in the city, I'm also the head of the Below the Cloud cause. It's a group of concerned citizens who want to know more about the people who live down there. We contest that it's actually you, those below the cloud, that is, who provide all our wealth by working in the mines. We hope to make things better for everyone below the cloud. We're still a small group, but with you as a representative from below, we could start to make some real change. We'll discuss it afterward." Kalan became lost in a fantasy of uniting the worlds below and above. She could see Set getting to grow up in a place like Trellis's apartment instead of in a different unit every cycle, struggling to scavenge enough charge to survive. She saw herself showing Set what she'd seen. All this light, strange animals, so many books for her to look at. Even the floor here is soft. She glanced down at it and saw her boot, remembering the toe. The fantasy shattered when she remembered what she was and how long she had left. That would have been nice, but I can still get back to her. I have to stay focused on that. Trellis lifted his arm and made a waving motion, then continued talking. "Now it truly is time for you to get to work. I don't want to take up too much of your time. A robot, like the ones in the street, walked in from the hallway and stood right behind her. It was holding scrubbing tools and an air tank. Kalan lost the ability to breathe. "Renfield here will help you in your task. Won't you, Renfield?" The robot made no reply. Trellis, seeing Kalan's terrified look, said, "Oh, don't worry, Renfield won't hurt you. Isn't that right, Renfield?" Again, no reply. Trellis led the still petrified Kalan over to the far end of the room, where the books met the windows. He pressed a small button at the corner of a shelf, and it slid behind the other one, revealing a garage. Inside was one of the gliders and an assortment of other equipment. There was a small airlock in the corner for going outside for maintenance or cleaning. Trellis led Kalan and Renfield to the door of the airlock and motioned for both of them to go in. She was uneasy about getting into the small room with the robot, but she didn't feel she had a choice at this point. She needed to get through this whole ordeal and get back down the elevator. Renfield wrapped a harness around Kalan's existing one, which she supposed was useless here with all the light. Then it attached a rope to the harness and a hoop sticking out of the wall. Kalan watched as the robot did this and thought about how many times she'd come across a fallen scrubber, and how some kind of safety line like this would have saved their lives. Renfield placed a board on the ground and lifted two handles along its sides. Then it gently nudged her onto the board. Her hands naturally grabbed the handles. The board lifted several centimeters off the ground and began floating in place. She tightened her grip apprehensively. The robot fitted the tank onto one side of the board and a scrub brush to the other. It motioned for Kalan to put on her mask, so she did, and the robot took a hose from the tank and attached it to a port on the mask. She'd always wanted to know what that was for. A burst of clean air began streaming into the mask. The added pressure burned her lungs even further. She was reaching her limit to how much of this clean, poisonous air she could endure. The window in front of her opened. She felt the rush of air move out past her, and the temperature dropped significantly. The robot gently pushed the board out over the ledge of the building. Then she dropped.